The cold air from the sea stung our cheeks sharply as we left the close atmosphere of the little crowded tent. The sighing of the trees, the waves breaking below on the rocks, and the lines and patches of mist driving about us seemed to create the momentary illusion that the whole island had broken loose and was floating out to sea like a mighty raft. The doctor moved just ahead of me, quickly and silently. He was making straight for the Canadian's tent, where the sides still boomed and shook as the creature of sinister life raced and tore about impatiently within. A little distance from the door he paused and held up a hand to stop me. We were perhaps a dozen feet away. "Before I release it, you shall see for yourself," he said, "that the reality of the werewolf is beyond all question. The matter of which it is composed is, of course, exceedingly attenuated, but you are partially clairvoyant, and even if it is not dense enough for normal sight, you will see something." He added a little more I could not catch. The fact was that the curiously strong vibrating atmosphere surrounding his person somewhat confused my senses. It was the result, of course, of his intense concentration of mind and forces, and pervaded the entire camp and all the persons in it. And as I watched the canvas shake and heard it boom and flap, I heartily welcomed it, for it was also protective. At the back of Sangree's tent stood a thin group of pine trees, but in front and at the sides the ground was comparatively clear. The flap was wide open, and any ordinary animal would have been out and away without the least trouble. Dr. Silence led me up to within a few feet, evidently careful not to advance beyond a certain limit, and then stooped down and signaled to me to do the same. And looking over his shoulder, I saw the interior lit faintly by the spectral light reflected from the fog, and the dim blot upon the balsam boughs and blankets signifying Sangree, while over him and round him and up and down him flew the dark mass of something on 4 legs, with pointed muzzle and sharp ears plainly visible against the tent sides, and the occasional gleam of fiery eyes and white fangs. I held my breath, and kept utterly still, inwardly and outwardly, for fear, I suppose, that the creature would become conscious of my presence. But the distress I felt went far deeper than the mere sense of personal safety, or the fact of watching something so incredibly active and real. I became keenly aware of the dreadful psychic calamity it involved. The realization that Sangree lay confined in that narrow space with this species of monstrous projection of himself, that he was wrapped there in the cataleptic sleep, all unconscious that this thing was masquerading with his own life and energies, added a distressing touch of horror to the scene. In all the cases of John Silence, and they were many and often terrible, no other psychic affliction has ever, before or since, impressed me so convincingly with the pathetic impermanence of the human personality, with its fluid nature, and with the alarming possibilities of its transformations. "Come," he whispered, after we had watched for some minutes the frantic efforts to escape from the circle of thought and will that held it prisoner. "Come a little farther away while I release it." We moved back a dozen yards or so. It was like a scene in some impossible play, or in some ghastly and oppressive nightmare from which I should presently awake to find the blankets all heaped up upon my chest. By some method undoubtedly mental, but which, in my confusion and excitement, I failed to understand, the doctor accomplished his purpose, and the next minute I heard him say sharply under his breath, "It's out! Now watch!" At this very moment a sudden gust from the sea blew aside the mist, so that a lane opened to the sky, and the moon, ghastly and unnatural as the effect of stage limelight, dropped down in a momentary gleam upon the door of Sangree's tent, and I perceived that something had moved forward from the interior darkness and stood clearly defined upon the threshold. And at the same moment the tent ceased its shuddering and held still. There in the doorway stood an animal, with neck and muzzle thrust forward, its head poking into the night, its whole body poised in that attitude of intense rigidity that precedes the spring into freedom, the running leap of attack. It seemed to be about the size of a calf, leaner than a mastiff, yet more squat than a wolf, and I can swear that I saw the fur ridged sharply upon its back. Then its upper lip slowly lifted, and I saw the whiteness of its teeth. Surely no human being ever stared so hard as I did in those next few minutes. Yet the harder I stared, the clearer appeared the amazing and monstrous apparition. For after all it was Sangree, and yet it was not Sangree. It was the head and face of an animal, and yet it was the face of Sangree, the face of a wild dog, a wolf, and yet his face. The eyes were sharper, narrower, more fiery, yet they were his eyes run wild. The teeth were longer, whiter, more pointed, yet they were his teeth grown cruel. The expression was flaming, terrible, exultant, yet it was his expression, carried to the border of savagery, his expression as I had already surprised it more than once, only dominant now, fully released from human constraint, with the mad yearning of a hungry and importunate soul. It was the soul of Sangree, the long-suppressed, deeply loving Sangree, expressed in its single and intense desire, pure, utterly wonderful. Yet at the same time came the feeling that it was all an illusion. I suddenly remembered the extraordinary changes the human face can undergo in circular insanity, when it changes from melancholia to elation, and I recalled the effect of hashish, which shows the human countenance in the form of the bird or animal to which in character it most approximates. And for a moment I attributed this mingling of Sangree's face with a wolf to some kind of similar delusion of the senses. I was mad, deluded, dreaming. The excitement of the day and the dim light of stars and bewildering mist combined to trick me. I had been amazingly imposed upon by some false wizardry of the senses. It was all absurd and fantastic. It would pass. And then, sounding across this sea of mental confusion like a bell through the fog, came the voice of John Silence, bringing me back to a consciousness of the reality of it all. Sangree, in his double. And when I looked again, more calmly, I plainly saw that it was indeed the face of the Canadian, but his face turned animal, yet mingled with the brute expression of a curiously pathetic look like the soul seen sometimes in the yearning eyes of a dog, the face of an animal shot with vivid streaks of the human. The doctor called to him softly under his breath. "Sangree! Sangree, you poor afflicted creature, do you know me? Can you understand what it is you're doing in your body of desire?" For the first time since its appearance the creature moved. Its ears twitched, and it shifted the weight of its body onto the hind legs. Then lifting its head and muzzle to the sky, it opened its long jaws and gave vent to a dismal and prolonged howling. But when I heard that howling rise to heaven, the breath caught and strangled in my throat, and it seemed that my heart missed a beat. For though the sound was entirely animal, it was at the same time entirely human. And more than that, it was the cry I had so often heard in the western states of America, where the Indians still fight and hunt and struggle. It was the cry of the redskin. "The Indian blood," whispered John Silence, when I caught his arm for support. "The ancestral cry." And that poignant, beseeching cry, that broken human voice mingling with the savage howl of the brute beast, pierced straight to my very heart, and touched there something that no music, no voice, passionate or tender, of man, woman, or child, has ever stirred before or since for 1 second into life. It echoed away among the fog and the trees and lost itself somewhere out over the hidden sea. And some part of myself, something that was far more than the mere act of intense listening, went out with it, and for several minutes I lost consciousness of my surroundings and felt utterly absorbed in the pain of another stricken fellow creature. Again the voice of John Silence recalled me.